Hi everyone. If you've seen some of our Jung To Live By videos before, or read Discover Your Personal Myth Ultimate Handbook, then you might know that Steve and Pauline Richards' clinical empiricism has found that the Jungian concept of the shadow tends to only appear in its usual definition when someone deliberately goes looking for it in themselves or others. It's as if it's simultaneously real as a concept and definable, but also not real unless one knows about the concept in advance. Such a statement might initially sound like a paradox, but if one inquires into it, it allows a deeper understanding to be reached with respect to the process of effective modelling as such. So, in this video, you're dropped into a high-level first-year IPSA professional training seminar, where I asked Steve and Pauline whether, within the context of their psychosystems analysis model of depth psychology, every shadow-based issue is necessarily an Anima-Animus-based one. If so, then that would reveal, implicitly, how a shadow-based issue could somaticize into a physical expression in the body, as a product of poor relating, rooted in someone's level of Anima-Animus development. Their response was to use their collapsed waveform method of meta-modelling, which our last video introduced onto this channel, to explore the deeper structure of the concept of the shadow, the Anima-Animus, and Jungian psychology as such, both to answer my question and to highlight just how essential it is to model human health in a systems-based approach. To do otherwise is to collapse into a single waveform, and most of the ground is missed for the figure. We really hope that you enjoy.
If you collapse into a Jungian framework, you will then have to, you are obliged by your frame of reference to look for things that may not be there, which means then it becomes a constructive process of literally building into an observation a theoretical construct which may not be there. And this really is the power of systems thinking, and the metaphor or analogy of a collapsed waveform emphasizes what happens when we focus our level of analysis, description, and explanation. It's not just to a systems level that can happen, it's also to a theoretical model level, which then becomes a filter for how we see that biopsychosocial stack. So if we're looking for a shadow because our model says it exists, we will probably find it. Freud rather famously said of Alfred Adler, pigs find truffles, socialist pigs find socialist truffles. Now, obviously, beneath the humour, black humour perhaps in that, pardon the expression, there is the truism that if you look for something with the intention of finding it, you will. And he meant that Adler was looking for a social level of analysis, description, and explanation. That was what was driving him. And what drove him literally was his power complex issues, and that was his model. So he would tend to see that everywhere. Freud has been, probably rightly, although sometimes a little unfairly, criticised for collapsing everything into psychosexuality. Jung has been largely left alone, but he does the same thing. He collapses into archetypes and fantasies and that kind of thing, and ignores, although he does say, he tries to get out of jail with this one and say you have to look at Freud and Adler before you look at him. You know, they're all collapsed waveforms. So the advantage of that biopsychosocial stack is that we have to stand back from it and say, what is happening? And what sense am I making of what is happening? What's the appropriate level of analysis, description, and explanation? So with that caveat in place then, if you're looking for a shadow, so to speak, then you're preloaded to find it. And you could answer that. Actually, Robert is more than capable of answering that. He will know what the Jungian description of the shadow is. So if it's likely to somaticize in some form, then he will be able to describe that. Any of us could, but I wonder at what point we get uncomfortable ourselves in using that and saying, there's something wrong here, this is an inadequate explanation, this is a psychologism.
And of course, Jung himself couldn't decide what he meant by the concept of the shadow.
No.
So
Yeah.
that is an added difficulty, isn't it? But in broad terms, if we mean the unconscious, then certainly the unconscious turns up in the body in the form of symptoms, in that very sort of simple way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. That's absolutely true. So how about if we take our own collapsed waveform, which is psychosystems analysis, and say, how would that look at that then, bearing in mind it has a non-psychoreductive biopsychosocial stack? Well, first of all, it would look at the different waveforms and how they would slot into the different levels. What do they reveal? What do they conceal? And then we would say, okay, what's our understanding of Jung's model of the shadow processed through our own frame of collapsed reference? Well, we, as you know, talk about on alter ego as a homeostatic opposite, but that doesn't exist on its own. It's something which is a function, in essence, to compensate for the one-sidedness of the ego. So basically, this is at the end of a line of compensation. You can think of it this way. And if we then compare that with Freud, well, then the unconscious and the instincts, that's all generally classified as the id. So there's the id pushing, and we can look at that as being instinctive pressure, and pretty much it's the same thing. There are differences. By the time it approaches consciousness, then there will be a number of filters in place. Mostly there will be complexes. One of them will be the moral complex, the equivalent of Freud's ego. So that will be filtering it according to internalized top-down morals and ethics, primarily learned through the parents. So that exists. Then we have what the ego does about the conflict that Freud called the pleasure principle versus the reality principle coming from the top. What happens then is there needs to be a compensation in order to have stability for the ego. Otherwise, it will just be squashed. If you think about it in that way, the forces from within, the forces without would generate and amplify a massive amount of neurosis. If you have a convenient bin in the form of a psychological structure which appropriates this information that comes in from the instincts which are not acceptable, there are opposites, if you like, in polarity or in charge or in value, morally, to the ego, then it can go there and it can stand in compensatory homeostatic regulation to the ego. And it'll do the same with that which comes in from the environment too. So in effect, it sits there to bleed off pressure from within and from without, and to keep the ego relatively optimized, but compensates for it. So that for us is the origin of that three-part system of the equivalence of Freud's psychic apparatus, as he called it, id, ego, and superego, where we think of instinctive pressure, and then with respect to the ego itself, a moral complex, which is really the first formulation that a child will have of the psychosocial world that forms through learned values. That's very important, because learned values are a set of rules that mean that something is good and something is bad and everything in between. Freud interpreted his observation as being the superego or superego. We interpret that as the moral complex, following Anthony Stevens, who said that such a construct was necessary for Jungians because they'd neglected it. So we then see then the alter ego as sitting in a compensatory and necessary relationship to the ego in order to help regulate internal pressure and external pressure when the Miller number fills up and when the self-concept is compromised. And then it will have a secondary role of reintroducing that which is temporarily housed if it gets too polarized. So where would we find the polarity that represents the alter ego then, if it somaticizes? That's, I'm taking it is the direction of the question. Remember that the alter ego, we can say, is the focus of Jung's collapsed waveform understanding of what he called the personal unconscious. That is everything that is acquired, according to him, therefore of all complexes. Any complex which is trying to get into the ego but is not identified with it, but is merely aligned, will be in orbit to some extent or filtered by the alter ego in its compensatory homeostatic role. So it's still fair to define the alter ego as being the nuclear complex of Jung's understanding of the personal unconscious. And when we're talking about theory, we do have to make compromises sometimes. So we will shape our theoretical narrative and explanation in accordance with an audience who can receive it. And then we'll shift again because the context changes. But there are some things that stay there. So if I appear to be contradicting myself, that is both true and inaccurate. Inaccurate with respect to the whole picture, true for specifics and for a specific context. So I would say that the alter ego is real and that it forms the equivalent of the nuclear complex of the personal unconscious if we collapse into Jung's model. If we don't, it's still there, but we see it doing different things. And we see it doing different things because our waveform alters and sees things that are not taken into account by Jung. But if we use a Jungian language, we resolve down, it's still there. That's dialectical syncretism in practice. Some things sustain when you compare and contrast and attempt to collide and merge different views. Those things that are still there are likely to be there for real. The shape of that observation, though, is still going to be regulated according to what frame that we take in order to look at it. So the shadow then, if it really exists in a Jungian sense, will somaticize in the body the same way as anything else does. There'll be no difference, except for this potentially, and we have to move into Freud to understand this. But in clinical practice, most people suffer from frustrated instinctive pressure in terms of adaptation to the environment. Most somatoform disorders, hysterical conversion reactions, anything that could be, and I've just given you two alternatives for the same thing, and there are others, anything like that will take the form that it does because of instinctive pressure, even more than social pressure. The social pressure will trigger instinct, and instinct will push against the resistance of social pressure. The ego feels that. So this is reality principle versus pleasure principle in Freudian terms. And then you will get something which somaticizes according to the meaning of that frustrated instinct. And the way into that, which we've been discussing in recent videos, is through affect, because affect is the a priori and primordial level of consciousness that moves away from the ego and into deep structure transduction along a Rossi pathway. So in that sense then, as I say, the shadow will somaticize like anything else. We may just call it the shadow or a shadow complex or an ego aligned complex or whatever it might be. But if you collapse into Jung, so to speak, then I would say the shadow will manifest in the body in exactly the same way as anything else, because the frustration element that leads to it is always instinctive. And then we get past the concept of the shadow and its limitations by looking at instinct. And then we follow Rossi along Rossi's pathways down into genomic expression and lifespan development on its timed release. And that immediately brings us back into the environment. A lot of biologists are working along the lines now that essentially the genome and the environment are a continuum in a system sense anyway. And that is entirely congruent with the way that we've always worked on empirical grounds, because it seems to be that way. And what happens, as I say, is that the way that we look at something collapses this into a specific state. So, as I say, if you want to mix theories, that's fine. Apply dialectical syncretism. That stops us being collapsed. I'm not saying anything else. We can collapse, but it's under control. And I'm looking at this now through a Jungian lens, and that's what I'm seeing. But then you hold it up against like Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar. I see no ships to your blind eye. The bit that you're not looking at. Take the eye patch off, and we have another look through the other eye. There's something else there. So this form of approach will give you an enormous amount of explanatory and translational power, theoretically, and that will itself transduce into clinical efficiency and efficacy. Because when you come to work with someone, you know what you're doing in a better way than you would if you were collapsed into a single frame of model with everything that comes with that. So the limitations of Freud being stuck biologically with his psychosexual theory, based on his own personal myth, the times in which he lived, that's a very dense and collapsed waveform. So is Adler, so is Jung. But almost invariably, you see people attach themselves to theoretical frameworks, and every time they do that, they collapse into it. And then you get a justification for that from within that framework that extrudes other things from consideration and excludes anything else from any kind of further consideration at all. There's a loyalty element to say, oh, I'm a Jungian, I'm a Freudian, they don't talk to each other. That's not good. That's not good for outcome with respect to our clients and patients. So in short then, it will somaticize any way any other complex does. A complex being primarily a reactionary process to pressure from the environment against instinct, for which the ego cannot adapt adequately. So the first place it will look to is its immediately opposite resource, which has been storing instinct and deploying that around and trying to balance things. That's what the true alter ego or shadow will do. The shadow in a pathological sense is just that. And remember that in our model, we say if we relate properly, the Jungian shadow as a construct is not a problem. If we don't relate properly, then what we see and confuse, in my view, as being the Jungian shadow is in fact poor relating. That generates that, it's that casts the shadow more than anything else. And then if we divide neurotically, we in essence create a complex which has the characteristics of a Jungian observation of something which we could call the shadow. But the etiology of it is poor relating. And of course, the Jungians don't go to relating. So, no, you must solve the shadow first, that initial neurotic division. That's not the way to solve it. It goes away immediately if you relate properly psychosocially and if you relate properly internally. So the shadow is a thing that can be produced neurotically as an alter ego nuclear complex in compensatory relationship to the ego. It's perfectly normal and healthy, and we should expect that as a function to exist within a systems model of human life, if that's a reasonable enough answer.
That's hugely helpful. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
One of the things that's you sparked off in my mind there. So we've collapsed into a waveform. So we were initially discussing that earlier. I'd say the Jungian shadow, or the Jungian shadow in the context of psychosystems analysis, whatever the correct nomenclature is. But one of the things I'm thinking of there is if we uncollapse the waveform, and just say, when we move down the stack, basically, instead of jumping from one to another, you uncollapse. Then when we collapse back then into, say, biology, looking for a somatic component, it might not be a one-to-one correlation, one alter ego as described psychologically to one appearance in the body. It could be multiple things, or as you've described, a plurality. So it's I don't know how useful this might be for other people, but just the image of uncollapsing, then recollapsing kind of reminded me there that it could have taken on any form in another level of analysis, description, and explanation, because it's the same information as defined mathematically with that definition. It will just take on a different form. That was hugely helpful. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. And one of the things that people feel with over a systems model is that they feel it's confusing, that there's too much information. That's understandable if they are in a collapsed state. If they're not in a collapsed state, too much information is no problem, because it can just slot in and it can oscillate. It's a frequency. There's a frequency that's biological, whatever it might be, or even within biology, different disciplines within biology are in a kind of harmonic resonance at that level of analysis, description, and explanation. And then they say, well, what about the theories? If I suddenly don't think like a Jungian, what do I make of transactional analysis, for example, or Gestalt therapy? And the usual response to that is to become eclectic, which is lazy in my view. It's unsystematic, and it says, well, okay, well, today I will use Eric Berne's transactional analysis. Maybe this afternoon it'll be Fritz Perl's Gestalt psychology and psychotherapy. Why? Where's the consistency of your own model building? If you can analyze what they do or claim to do and look for equivalence using dialectical syncretism, you can effortlessly move between these psychological theories, see where the overlap is. Where there's no overlap, there's something new to be learned potentially, you pressure test it. And if it doesn't work, you can set it aside. You've been systematic about it. So when people aren't organized with a proper meta model, first of all as a framework and then as a philosophy of practice, that they can't do this and they move away from it, so this is too much information overload. They fill their Miller number in terms of their capacity to model. You don't have to do that if you have a model like dialectical syncretism.